thank you all for being here this afternoon. I am so excited to have this conversation with Hannah and with Ian. Congratulations again on your phenomenal wins on your respective school boards, Carroll in Texas, Carroll Independent School District, North Texas, and Pelham, right outside or in Westchester?
Right in Westchester, right outside of New York City. Really
phenomenal.
Yep.
And both of their backgrounds are just amazing. You're an incredible attorney who has clerked twice at the Supreme Court. And Ian, your scholarship is just, it's so well known now, and all of your work over at AEI. So in addition to all of that, you're also opening schools as well. So you're putting policy into practice.
Yep.
Just really phenomenal. So I'm so excited to talk to both of you today. So first, we'll just get right into it, kick it off with some questions for you. We'll start with Hannah. What led you to run for school board?
Well, you know, I was enjoying living in Southlake, Texas with my 4 kids who range in age from first grade all the way up to 9th grade. And we were loving our life in a great suburb of Dallas and enjoying our practice as attorneys. And last August, there was an attempt to vote on a 34-page plan. It was called the Cultural Competence Action Plan. And it was accepted by the board by a vote of 5 to 2. There were only 2 conservatives that said, no, we shouldn't accept this plan. And it was then that the community really rose up and pushed back. And we mounted a response over the next several months. And finally, in January, when the time arose to throw your hat into the ring to run for school board, I just thought to myself, well, if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? And so I decided to run, and I'd never run for any elected office before, so it was quite an education by doing, but it was really fun, and we spent the next 3 to 4 months on the campaign trail educating our community about the CCAP and why it was bad for our schools and bad for our kids. And then on May 1st, my friend and fellow candidate, Cam Bryan, and I both won by a margin of 40 points. So 70% to 30%. So.
Before I toss it over to Ian, can you just say a few more words about this cultural competency plan? What does that mean in practice?
So it was a really radical plan. I had some friends of mine at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, whom I had worked with in religious liberty cases previously involving religious student groups on campus being kicked off of their college campuses because they weren't sufficiently woke. And so I asked FIRE to look at this document, and I said, here are my concerns. What do you think? Because you're the experts in this space. And they said, you know, this is the most radical plan we've seen anywhere in the country. They were trying to implement microaggression tracking and punishing of our students for subjective offenses, whether intentional or unintentional offenses in the eye of the beholder. They wanted to institute radical teacher training that were highly invasive based on race and equity. They wanted to institute a metric for performance reviews where teachers would be evaluated on whether or not they were sufficiently woke if they could retain their job. They wanted to do comprehensive equity audits of our entire curriculum, our entire procedures and processes for all of our districts, our communications and everything. And then the thing that really concerned me the most when I first looked at the plan was they wanted to do audits of all of our student groups. And having been a religious liberty attorney and having worked on these kinds of cases on the college level, I knew how dangerous that was, because once you start auditing student religious groups to see if their beliefs are in accordance with a particular political agenda, it's not soon after that that you'll find them disaccredited and kicked off of campus. So there were a lot of things in this plan that were highly troubling, but just the bottom line was that they wanted to institute a highly political agenda in our school district that would have been very damaging, not just for our students, but for our teachers and all of our families.
And you're sure this was Texas, right? Not like Portland, Oregon, or yeah.
This was in Texas, and I think that's what surprised people the most about it. You know, in one of the reddest counties of North Texas, Tarrant County is one of the most red counties around. And in Southlake, which is, you know, one of the most conservative communities in North Texas, we have probably about 65 to 70% Republican voter base in our community. And so the fact that they thought that they could pull this off in Southlake just tells you how brazen they are. And if they could do it in Southlake, they could probably do it anywhere. And so that's why we had to stop it.
Wow. Well, Ian, we've worked together for a long time. I think really started on success sequence work, getting to know one another. I know one of your passions is individual agency as well. In fact, I think you may have a book on this subject.
Yes, I do.
Coming out fall 2021. Can you talk a little bit about how that informed your decision to run, or was that what informed your decision to run?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. So my wife and I and our 2 children, Oscar and Camille, we moved to the small town Pelham, New York in 2012 when they were still in nursery school, and we just fell in love with this town, and we could see ourselves from nursery school all the way through 12th grade. Like many people, we moved to a community largely because of the quality of the schools, and we've been very happy. And then a few things happened, somewhat similar to Hannah's story, but last summer we were very dissatisfied with the plan that the school system had put forth for remote learning. And because I run schools and we were doing so many things to have synchronous instruction, live instruction with our faculty, we were really disappointed that the school system didn't get their act together. And so we decided to create a pod, partly inspiration from some of the work we had done. So we partnered with 10 other parents, and we hired a teacher, and we created this great solution for our kids. So I was already thinking, we're taking one of our kids out of the school system, but I really want to help strengthen it, given my experience in running schools. But that was not why I decided to run for school board. In January of this year, the school system published the equity audit. These things have similar names, so when you start to see these things, you start to recognize a pattern. And in this case, an outside organization called NYU Metro Center did an analysis with a very small sample size number of parents. You can even see it from the report that they produced, very small sample sizes with literally the same people going to the same meetings who are declaring how racist our school system was. And literally in the report, they separate feedback from white faculty, white parents, and everyone else in the quote-unquote BIPOC category, and all these stories of oppression, and not many of the amazing things going on. And as I looked at the report, it was really badly researched. So I decided to write a critique of the equity audit, because I've seen a bunch of these, and I thought it would be helpful for the larger community just to see an objective review. And I've published it, and I would gladly share it with anyone who receives an equity audit and look at the critique that I've done, because I think a lot of the things that I pointed out are the tactics that are used by people who produce these kinds of reports. I then met with the superintendent to share, here's my objective analysis, and there was misrepresentation of data, perpetuation of racial stereotypes in a negative fashion, and she seemed to really appreciate it, but the speeding train seemed to just keep going, that they were going to move forward with many of the recommendations, which would have done many of the kinds of things that you're talking about, with one of the most important being hire Metro Center again to continue to do this work. Right. But even then, I decided not to run for school board. It wasn't until actually, I then published the equity audit on the Pelham Facebook page for all parents. So there was 3,000 families, tight-knit community, and it was really, it landed with a huge impact, because everyone, there's this kind of fear that if you're talking about equity, you can't say anything. And so this document, which was this objective review, gave people some air, some oxygen to feel like, I noticed that too, but I didn't want to say anything. And so it gave permission to folks to say, look, we may have issues of race or racism in our schools, but it's certainly not to the extent that was portrayed here. And here are some of the great things that we're already doing. Why wasn't that represented? So that had an impact, but then my wife and I were kicked out of another Facebook group that was focused on kids. And this group of people were some of the people who were really the ones driving the equity audit. And it just became clear to me that if this is the way that this group of folk are going to handle conflicting narrative, then that's not the leadership, I think, that should be represented on our school board. So that's when I decided to run, and it was a really brutal battle. In the small town, suddenly, literally, my wife is getting menacing emails from people we've never met who've diagnosed me They literally trolled my entire internet presence. So literally all of my articles, see, he's, I've interviewed John King, Arnie Duncan, Betsy DeVos, but they found an article of me with Betsy DeVos. See, he's a Trump guy. And so it was really brutal. But the thing that was interesting, because my mantra was equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity across race.
Yep.
That was I just kept going back to the core principles for what we want our school system to be based upon. And I have to say, after a tough campaign, we won a resounding victory as well, because we had 5 candidates running for 2 seats, and we blew them out of the water. The top 2, I got the most votes, and the other 3 who were steeped in critical race theory, steeped in status quo, they lost badly. And I'm already facing the folks in status quo who want to preserve things, but we do have a mandate. And I do think it's inspiring that focusing on core principles was a motivator. It was infectious for people in our community who genuinely want our schools to be better, but don't want to feel demonized by race or any other accusation simply because they may disagree with a set of ideas. And meanwhile, the other side was really like, if you don't fully align with the orthodoxy, you're excommunicated. And that's not the ideology we want running school boards. And so I very much tried to model the behavior as a candidate that I would be doing as a school board member. So I wrote position papers, not only on the equity audit, but because of my work running international baccalaureate schools, how we could strengthen the school program. So I think it's also important not to get pigeonholed into only one issue, because parents, the reason I think that parents are so frustrated, it's like, wait a minute, what about the academics? What about X? What about Y? And so don't get so fixated on critical race theory or equity audits to the point where now you've gone down that rabbit hole as well. So it was really important for me to show that I'm not only anti this, here are the things that I'm for that can improve your kids' education.
And that happened in our race too, because we really focused on, transparency. I think a lot of the community felt like through the CCAP process, there was just a complete lack of transparency between the district and the school board and the community. We talked about accountability. We talked about a lot of basic principles that really resonated with people. It wasn't just we're against CCAP, but we're against, we're for holding the district accountable to all of these different measures.
Very important.
That's great. Well, Hannah, I mean, this is a tricky topic, right? The things that Ian just mentioned, for a lot of families, it's difficult to engage, and parents are frustrated. I think a lot of families just don't know what is the best way. If I want to engage with a school board, what do you advise parents? What works best? What are good tactics so that the school board does listen to the families who are coming to them? Any advice?
Sure, absolutely. So what we did was we formed a Facebook group of all of the Southlake conservatives. We started posting educational informational articles so people could get up to speed on what critical race theory is and how it has played out already in other states across the country that were further along than we are here in Texas. Where does this lead? We wanted to show them. And then, we started just showing up at board meetings, hundreds of people showing up at board meetings. Public comments took several hours. And we would have meetings before the board meetings to prepare the talking points, what we were going to say, divide up the topics, so that people were informed and they felt comfortable and they felt educated on what they could say to the school board, so the school board would actually listen to them. We also did a whole lot of open records requests. If you don't know how to do them, find out now and start asking your district for information. We submitted probably hundreds of open records requests to get the information about the CCAP, what they had already implemented. Some of the teacher training slide decks that we got back from our open records requests were horrifying. They had put our administrators and executive directors together in an administrative retreat, and they had schooled them on white supremacy, white identity, implicit bias. There was a slide that asked them to identify characteristics of white culture. So it was already happening. It was already going on. And so we found all of this out through open records requests. And those were hugely important for us to be able to push back against the narrative that they were trying to sell, that they had not done any of this was not implemented, and that this was not going to be a problem for our district. We also, really tried to do webinars for the whole community. So we had experts from fire and from other organizations that were already well-versed in these issues host webinars online for our community. Anyone could join to learn more so that they would feel more comfortable about speaking out. And then finally, we really just tried to educate the community at large. We sent out a newspaper to the entire zip code of Southlake, and the newspaper highlighted all of the things that we had uncovered through the open records requests, all of the really damaging facts that the administration didn't want us to share, and people who either had kids that had already graduated, were empty nesters, or weren't really tied into the schools because they were in private schools or they homeschooled. They really became much more energized after receiving this newspaper and learning out more about what was happening in their district. And they understood that this was not just a problem for parents with kids in the district, but this was a problem for our entire community. Because once the schools, our award-winning schools, Southlake Carroll is regularly ranked number 1 or number 2 in the entire state of Texas, they understood that if that ranking went down, that their property values would decrease, and that this was a bad thing for the entire community. So we tried to just show them through newspaper articles from around the country. I talked about places like Boston and New York and Seattle and Chicago, where equity audits had led to the eradication of gifted and talented programs. And what would that mean for our school district? If we went down this road of equity and got rid of our gifted and talented programs, what would that mean for your child? 3 of my 4 kids are in gifted and talented programs. I don't want to see that program go away just because of some political agenda that seeks to instill racial equity rather than equality of opportunity for all students. So just talking about those things and the real world application of what these things would lead to was really effective in bringing people along.
Well said.
Just one quick note is that your election was May 1st, right? Our election was May 18th. When you won, it was a seismic impact across the country, especially in Pelham. Awesome. Because my opponents then used your victory as weaponry against me. So they tried to then say, we want to nationalize this election, because see what happened in Southlake, we don't want to happen here. So, because I had the opportunity as well to bring outside speakers in, but I actually resisted the temptation to nationalize the election. So I went local. I went deep. So I literally looked at 3 years of board minutes, because there was a reputation that the board had just become a rubber stamp for the administration. So what are the ways you can check if a board is a rubber stamp? Look at the votes. In 3 years for a 7-member board, every single vote was 7-0. Not a single recorded dissenting vote in 3 years. And this is a loophole in New York, it sounds like it's different in Texas, when residents come to the school board meeting and express their concerns, it's late at night, parents come, they have concerns, the board literally just sits there stone-faced, no response, right? And so I started to really mount this campaign. Look, I'm not Betsy DeVos, I'm not, look, we have local issues. And so I think it's a tactic, if you do decide to run, you really have to think about how much you want to make your town a flashpoint for something like critical race theory and some of these larger issues, and how much do you really want to get down to the roots of your own community? Because frankly, that's what folks care about. Yeah. There's all this stuff, but are we going to have a gifted and talented program? Or is the International Baccalaureate going to go from middle school to high school? Is our board going to respond when, are our elected officials actually going to respond to us? And so that was a tactic that we really honed in on after your victory, because it was so important and it was so terrifying to many of our opponents in Pelham.
Well, as a reminder, you do have little note cards on your table. If you want to send questions to Hannah or to Ian, do that and we'll collect them, and we'll ask those toward the end. So Hannah, you made a really important distinction a second ago between sorry, we're switching to live mics for Q&A instead of note cards, so a mic will come around. Thank you. You made a really important distinction between equity and equality a minute ago. Ian, you've also made a really important distinction. This is something that you said in the session that you had earlier between, I think the way you described it was, what impact does teaching, say, the tenets of CRT to a child have relative to teaching the success sequence?
Yep.
And can you kind of reiterate some of that? I thought it was really
well.
profound.
I mean, as many people know, a lot of the underlying ideology behind critical race theory is fixated on this idea that America itself is an inherently racist nation. Racism permeates every single institution to the point where it is insurmountable, right? So any racial disparity must be due to structural racism. Nicole Hannah-Jones, author of the 1619 Project, in explaining her rationale for why the government should, pay about $15 trillion in reparations, said that there's nothing a black person can do. Not get married, not get educated, not buy a home, not save, none of those things can overcome, in her words, 400 years of racialized plundering. And if I had a teacher in my school system that said those things to my kids, they would be fired the next day. Because you cannot, first of all, it's not true, and then second, you can't create this impression that you live in a country that's permanently hostile to your dreams, especially when there are millions and millions of people who've actually embraced founding principles, key civic institutions to move from persecution to prosperity. So things like the success sequence, which is a term some of you may know, but it's, even if you don't know the term, it's probably behavior that you've practiced in your own life. And so it's get an education, then a full-time job of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work. And then if you have children, marriage first. Like, the data is overwhelming. Like 97% of the people who have followed that across race enter the middle class or beyond. So imagine two different classrooms with a classroom of low-income kids. One class is saying, there is nothing you can do. All of these other tactics, there's nothing you can do unless the government has this massive $1 trillion reparations program. Or you are going to face challenges. There is still remnant racism in our country, and yet there are strategies to overcome it. And by the way, this message applies to low-income white kids, low-income black kids, period, that there are these strategies that you can deploy. It's much more about building agency. And to me, the critical race theory not only is inherently, in my view, corrosive, it turns the attention away. It robs young people of the very sense of possibility that's so critical for our country.
And it also undoes the very substantial gains that we made in the Civil Rights Act, of 1964. Right. I mean, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said, we are going to be a colorblind society. We are not going to look at race, ethnicity, gender, religion, all of the protected categories. We're not going to look at those categories for anything. That's not going to be relevant at all. And what critical race theory does is actually erases all of that and says, we are going to use race, we are going to use ethnicity, we're going to use those protected categories to achieve the equitable outcomes that we deem appropriate. And so, during the campaign, Hugh mentioned all of the things that were thrown at you. We were called racist, we were called all sorts of nasty things, and I would say, actually, you are the one who is being a racist, because you're the one who's using race and ethnicity to try and achieve your political agenda and your outcome, and that is inherently racist.
Yeah. Well, speaking of running, when you were running, were there strategies, and just a warning, this is our last question before we turn to all of you, were there strategies that you think worked really well that you would tell someone who's thinking about running themselves for school board to employ?
I think just really activating your base was hugely important for us. We had amazing volunteers that were in the thick of it with us for the school board meetings, that showed up to speak, that showed up to write emails to the board, that showed up to do all those things. And they turned into sort of the core of our volunteers for the campaign, which was hugely helpful to us. And I think, we knew that if we could turn out our base, we had a community that was basically 65 to 70% Republican, conservative. So if we just got them out to the polls, that we would win. And so really the most important thing for us was just getting them to the polls. So we had professional canvassers that went door to door, twice in particular precincts that were very highly concentrated Republican, to get them educated and then to turn them out to vote. And that was hugely successful. We also, used texting and calling and robocalls and Facebook ads and all sorts of social media to get people out to vote. And we also hosted about 70 different meet and greets over the period of about 3.5 months in different segments of our community, meeting with people in a close setting, 40 to 50 to 60 people at a time, was hugely successful in just talking to people one-on-one and answering their questions. We also had a PAC that we formed in our community, the South Lake Families PAC, which was really helpful because they raised a lot of money and they sent out mailers, to support us in the campaign. So if you don't have a conservative PAC in your community, I would highly recommend forming one. It was really successful in our election. And then just really, educating your community. I think that's the number one thing that you can do, is just tell people why this is so wrong and that you're running to eradicate it.
Thank you. And Ian, you said keep it local.
Yeah, keep it local. And I think one of the things is don't wait until the school board election to get involved with your local schools. Because we had gone through the analysis when we decided to keep our kids out and create a pod, that process actually put me in touch with the superintendent, some board members. They actually really respected the decision we made because we'd done a ton of research. And so it was a way to get to know everyone. And again, this was even before I was considering running. But they got to know me as a human being, so they couldn't as easily make a caricature out of me that they then attempted to do later on. But because of my involvement, and I was active in the community, so there's a lot of reason to not wait, because it's like a perpetual campaign. So, join committees, learn who the board members are that are persuadable. It's a 7-member board, there are 2 of us on, but we know 2 of the board members who likely will be influenced by the way that we think. And also just do your homework. Again, looking through 3 years of board minutes, 450 votes, 80 plus meetings, it's an arduous process. But get to know what your neighbors are thinking about. I had meet and greets every weekend in person, on Zoom, lots of meetings at people's homes. My first endorsement letter, really important, even though it's not a political campaign, I got prominent Democrats in town and prominent Republicans in town to sign on. It confounded people that I was able to get that. But if you're part of the community and you're working, it's a lot easier to get over these political divides. So that was actually one of the very first big moves I made, because I signaled from the very beginning that I'm here for the kids. And so get involved early. Try not to be ideological. It sounds like in your case it actually helped. It was really important because our community is not as red. So I had to have a message. And also I run schools in the heart of the South Bronx. So, I had some cred, some street cred in this area.
Yeah. That's great. Well, we'd love to open it up for questions. If you can just wait on the mic to come around. It's right behind you there.
Great discussion, thank you. So do you have any good one-liners or sound bites to zing critical race theory arguments?
Ian, you're the king of the one-liners.
Equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity across race. Seriously, I literally said that hundreds of times and wrote it in my position papers. And again, I have to say that, people weren't expecting that. They were expecting some, this is terrible, which it is, but there's a lot in the delivery. And people believe in core principles and fairness and equality of opportunity. They don't want their community separated by race and particularly demonized by race. And if we appeal to the founding principles, I think you'll find that it's very infectious.
Out there. These lights are bright. Yes, in the front here. You just wait for the...
Hi, my name is Emma Blair. I'm part of the Rising Young Leaders program. And my question for you is, how can we get high schoolers specifically more involved in the school district, and how can we be a voice? I'm from Arizona, and a couple of years ago during the Red for Ed movement, it was fascinating to me how high schoolers who can't vote themselves were able to influence so many people, even their parents, to join the movement. So on our side, how can we get high schoolers more involved, whether that's even standing up to say the Pledge of Allegiance during school or things like that?
That's a really great question. We actually were running largely against a very organized high school group. It was called the South Lake Anti-Racist Coalition. It's a bunch of high schoolers that had Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook accounts, and they were running a very hard campaign for the CCAP. And it's hard as an adult to engage a high school student, because the moment you attack the core arguments or the core principles, they say, well, they're just a high school student, they're doing their best, they're trying something new, So we had to largely sort of ignore the high school component on the other side, and a lot of the high schoolers that were conservative, from conservative families, really didn't want to get publicly involved because of the cancel culture in their high school and the concern that they would just be publicly shamed on social media. So we did have a few high school students show up at public comments for board meetings, but what we did do behind the scenes is we formed a Turning Point USA chapter in our community, and we organized our conservative kids through the Turning Point USA chapter, and that really helped them find some camaraderie and some fellowship with fellow conservatives in our community. And even though they didn't get overtly involved in public comments at board meetings or whatever for the most part, they were, I think, they did feel that comfort from being with their fellow conservatives.
Yeah, we had there was a group of high schoolers that frankly were organized by the adults.
Yes.
But there was no upside to go against the high school kids. There just wasn't. It would have been, from a tactical perspective, we just had to let that go. Ironically, after I won, the head of the Pelham High School Republican Club wrote to me and said, "We're so excited that you won. There's so many of us who believed in you, but we didn't want to say anything during the campaign." So always know that there's a squeaky wheel, whatever, but there is a silent group of adults and kids that don't like this, right? That don't want to feel at every moment you're going to do something that, you're the R word, or you're the anti, you're something negative. There are a lot of people that don't believe it, and I really wanted to just give permission to folks to say that it's okay to disagree, and we can disagree honorably and still be committed to the best outcomes for kids.
But we did make sure that our conservative families got their high school seniors registered to vote.
Oh, yeah.
And we did make sure that they knew all of the rules for absentee ballots to get their recently graduated college kids to vote as
Totally,
well. So
yeah. We worked
we did
that
activate
too.
that.
We worked that angle.
Do you get the sense that, from where I stand, I feel like the media has followed parent engagement with school boards more lately than I can recall. So I feel like, from the parents' perspective, showing up at these school board meetings, it really is making an impact. We see it on the local news every night. Mm-hmm. So, is that the sense from your seat as a school board member? Does it really make a difference when parents show up and are bringing these questions directly to the board?
I think it makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
I think the pressure that the administration felt from hundreds of parents showing up every single board meeting put enormous pressure on them to realize that we weren't going away, and if they continued down this track, it was going to get worse. So they better do something to address our concerns. And I think that is largely the reason why we have been so successful. To date, right now, our new superintendent that was just hired in January, he came in, he assessed the situation, and we now have 4 of the top leaders in the administration that were pushing the CCAP. They are no longer returning to the district in the fall. So they're gone, which is a great win. And he is really responsive to our concerns, you know. So I just think it's hugely important to have that pressure from the public, because that's your constituency. I mean, that's who they are responding to, and that's who they should be accountable to.
That's exactly
Yep.
right.
And I would just add that the only caution I'd say is that it's really important what parents are saying, because the one danger of this whole approach is, and this applies to legislation as well, we don't want to come off saying we are trying to ban an idea, to ban critical race theory in the sense of, you know, banning objective ideas, because if you believe in free speech, you actually have to allow free speech to happen. And so it's really, it's a thin line, but it's an important line, that what we're against are the practices that typically come along with critical race theory. So that's the, you know, professional development, where all the white teachers go here and all the non-white teachers here, and all the white teachers have to declare their oppressive tendencies because that's against the law. That's a violation of the Civil Rights Act. Or if you have to declare your, again, oppressive tendencies, and that's compelled speech, and that's against the First Amendment. And so it's just really important that there is some acknowledgement that sure, racism exists, sure, there are these factors, but our society has advanced quite significantly where, yes, we should all come together and fight whatever remnants exist, but it's not that we're saying we shouldn't teach about slavery in our classrooms, because there's a narrative that's starting to happen where opponents are trying to frame people like us as not wanting to talk about America's history. And we're fighting both legally in courts, but we're also fighting in the court of public opinion. So when parents speak about this, they should really, I think, in my view, try to acknowledge some of the issues that people are saying, but focus on the practices, not the ideas, because we don't want to be accused of the same kind of cancel culture that we're concerned with on the other side.
Right, and that was one of the things that I focused on a lot too, was that, you know, we don't want to have our students be scared to talk about race in the classroom. And if you are going to track microaggressions and it's subjective in the eye of the victim, then kids are going to just not talk. They're not going to engage in constructive conversations about race and about our history and all of it. Their speech is going to be chilled. And that's a significant concern from the free speech perspective. And so I think just talking about principles of free speech is really an important way to address this as well, because it gets people understanding that you're not trying to stop them from talking about the hard questions in our history, but you're trying to get them to do it from an objective standpoint and allow all opinions to be heard.
And since we don't always have something as clear as a cultural competency plan or an equity audit, and we don't always see it written explicitly in curriculum, how do we know what to look for when it comes to CRT?
Yeah, so there's lots of buzzwords, right? Equity was mentioned over 120 times in this 34-page document, never defined anywhere. So equity is a big one. Cultural competence, cultural proficiency, culturally proficient teaching practices. A lot of this also comes in through social emotional learning. So a lot of social emotional learning companies right now are reevaluating their curriculum through the lens of race and equity. And there are actually explicit statements out there that say SEL is the lever for equity in our curriculum. So be very careful when you're adopting curriculum that has SEL in it, because that's often the avenue for introducing critical race theory.
Yeah, I would agree. The buzzwords, I mean, the precursors usually are some kind of equity audit, some kind of cultural, there's usually some sort of originating document, which then becomes the evidence for everything else, right? One thing I'm literally now doing, because I'm now going to be taking the seat on the board, something we use in our schools is as an academic dashboard, that for all the schools in your district, you can see how are they doing on interim assessments, special education, discipline, attendance, and I discovered that the board currently does not actually utilize an academic dashboard. I'm like, well, how do you oversee the district? Like, we trust the administrators. And so what's interesting about that, so I'm going to be pushing very hard to now have an academic dashboard, because then I ask the question, well, then what are you doing if you're not overseeing the academics? The Cultural Competence Committee. So they fill the void of what they should be focused on with some of this other nonsense, which is working at cross purposes with what a board should really be focused on.
And that's actually what a lot of our opponents said was, CRT is nowhere in the CCAP. What are you talking about? There's no CRT in there. And we're like, that's just not true, because we've seen the slide decks, we've seen the training, we know that those principles are in there. And they would try and sell the CCAP as just a basic plan of kindness and human decency and respecting your classmates. And I used to say all the time, I am all for all of those things, but that is not what the CCAP is about.
Correct.
Well, before we transition to part 2 of this session, please join me in thanking our panelists and congratulating them. Very well done.